interest and you're now falling asleep. So I decided I wouldn't do that. I will show you various pieces from different parts of the weaving world, but I thought it'd be better and more useful to develop what I like to think of as the theme of looking at rugs. How do we look at them? What are we looking for? And so I'll really gear the presentation along that line. We're going to start with a picture of a quite splendid 18th century Central Asian carpet. This is by one of the Turkmen weaving groups, the Omud. It's one of the splendors of the Textile Museum collection. And as you can see, I think you can see my little cursor here. It has big border elements at either end. Sometimes we call these skirts. And then it has a true border element here, as you can see, on a white ground, and interior patterning. And I'll be discussing various aspects of this sort of architecture of the rug as I go along. Let me also introduce a couple of books, actually a few. I think Kartika has talked to you about Elizabeth Barber's wonderful book, A Woman's Work. It's a fabulous book. And then for those of you who actually decide to become interested in carpets or want a reference text, Oriental Carpets by the Islands, Murray Island and his son, Murray Island. This is sort of the Bible of the field. It's a very complete accounting of exactly what I described earlier, starting at one end of the weaving world and working your way to the other. The third edition, the most recent edition, is the one you want. Very good pictures, excellent text, quite comprehensive. And then two more books to consider. These are generalist books, one called Oriental Carpets, the other Silk Carpets, and so forth. Both of these are by John Thompson, who is a noted scholar and lecturer, quite an expert on rugs, who passed away just a few months ago. And the reason I'm showing them is, in addition to recommending that you at least know about them, is that they illustrate a ground loom, as you can see here, and a vertical loom that you can see here. I think Kartika has probably acquainted you with these two types of looms. Now let's start with another carpet. So this is a rug that sold several years ago at Sotheby's. It was in the collection of the Corcoran Gallery of Art here in Washington. The Corcoran, as you may know, is no longer an independent entity. It fell on economic hard times, and as a result had to sell off some of its collection, including carpets. They had actually a reasonably substantial carpet collection that had been established in the first part of the 20th century by wealthy donors, and William Clark being one of them. And this rug, the famous sickle cell leaf rug, was then put up for auction in 2013 at Sotheby's, and it went for what was then and still is a record price of in excess of $33 million. And when you look at this, what you see is a swirl of activity, visual activity, with a variety of elements and a very complex patterning. It really looks like a real mishmash. But by the end of our presentation here, we'll go back to this carpet, and I think we'll be able to take it apart, and you'll begin to see how all the elements work together. So that's a sickle leaf carpet, and the reason for that is, the reason for the name is, of course, these serrated leaves, and we'll talk about them in a little while. So here's a view of the weaving world, which, as I've sort of alluded to, starts in China, ends up all the way over in Turkey and little bits and pieces of Europe. There's some done in North Africa, although it's off the map here. But on balance, this is a fair representation of where carpets have been woven and where they've been woven for thousands of years. Now, there are a couple of ways to think about these products. Obviously, they arose in a very rural environment out in the countryside, but their real development as an artistic expression comes with the patronage of important and very powerful people, typically emperors and kings and the like. And so I thought I'd bring to your attention some of the empires that dominated this region over time. These aren't names that you are going to use in daily life, but they're useful for you to know about the terms. And if somebody says, oh, this is a Seljuk motif or from a Timurid time, at least you'll have a sense of what we're talking about. I'm not going to be in the least bit comprehensive about commenting on them. So there are 5 big empires that you need to think about. The first is the Seljuk Empire. And this was operational, as you can see here, around 1100. And it coexisted with the Byzantine Empire that you probably all have heard of, and the Fatimids, who were active in the region of Egypt. Now, these empires, this one and the subsequent ones, many of them begin with the westward expansion of Turkic tribes, which outgrow their surround in Central Asia, and they need more grazing ground. And they are accomplished horsemen because they've been on the horse since they were a day old. They're also great archers. And so they have a style of movement and fighting which allows them to dominate more sedentary cultures. Somebody living in a town is not necessarily riding a horse every day, shooting a bow and arrow backwards, looking backwards as he rides. But these guys did it all the time. They were really good at it and extremely bloodthirsty. So the Seljuks, very important. They're followed by the Mongols. Now I should say, let me go back to the Seljuks. The Seljuks actually are associated with the production of a variety of artistic components. And so we see their name associated with architecture and tiles, etc. And of course, carpets. The Mongols, in contrast, although they had the largest empire, didn't really make stuff. They liked it. That was one of the driving forces of their conquest, was to get more stuff to send back to the people at home. But we don't really associate a lot of production with them. They're followed by the Timurids, named after Timur, their leader, one of the most bloodthirsty of all the conquerors, but also one of the most interested in the arts. And so during his time, there was a great flowering of artistic expression in a variety of media. And then we have the 3 coexisting empires, the Ottoman here in Turkey and parts beyond. In Iran, the Safavid Empire. At that time, of course, this was called Persia. And then the latest, the Mughals in India. Okay, so Kartika has covered a little bit of this in your previous discussions, but I'll just go through some of it, at least as it references carpet production. So to weave a rug, we have to invent stuff. I know she's discussed with you the invention of string and the notion of spinning. And that's possible, spinning, because of the structure of the fibers that are used in textiles and carpets. So yeah, we have to invent sheep. The precursor of sheep is a wild animal known as the mouflon. And it has a hairy outer coat, which can't spin. And it has a very thin wool type undercoat, which doesn't really lend itself to much spinning either, very short fibered. So this required a great deal of, first of all, domestication and then actual breeding to develop over thousands of years, a sheep that looks like this. So now you see we've lost the hairy outer coat. We have now a thick wool with a long fiber. And because of the structure, and I think Kartika has covered this, the microscopic structure of the fiber, they can stick together. And that's, of course, the basis of felting and spinning and the production of yarn or string from wool. There's, of course, cotton. Again, because of the structure of the fiber, it can stick to itself. That's absolutely crucial. And as a result, you can spin it and make a long string or yarn or thread. And finally, there's silk, which I think, as Kartika has also mentioned, has a sticky outer coat. And thus strands can be strung together, spun together to make a thicker fiber from a very thin fiber. Now, I know she's also discussed with you the basics of weaving. And what I want to emphasize here, first of all, it's ancient. Second, it's a rectilinear form. It's basically a grid. Things are going up and down, and things are going across. This is a structure that we call a plane weave. And if the wefts are packed down so that you can't see the warps, that actually is the structure of a very common type of textile that we'll discuss in a minute. In fact, the piece that you see on the wall behind me is constructed of exactly that type of simple weave in which the wefts are packed down so you can't see the warps. The piece behind me on the wall is a 17th century kilim from central Anatolia. Now, pile carpets have another dimension, of course, and that's the tuft that reaches upward, if you will, and forms the pile. For our purposes, there are really two kinds of knots that you need to be aware of. There are others, but these are the most important ones. One is called the symmetric knot for obvious reasons, because the tufts that reach upward, forming the pile, are actually included within two warps within that space. They wrap around the warps and they come up, and so each side is symmetric to the other. Sometimes this is referred to as the Turkish knot. This is very typical in village weaving. It has a limitation in that you can't really work out a very complex curvilinear pattern. And so you tend to typically see it in, as I say, in nomadic or village weaving, where the patterns are somewhat simpler. If you want to make a more complicated, more curvilinear pattern, then you, in many cases, have to use an asymmetric knot. Here you can see that the two tufts are actually split by one of the warps. And sometimes the warps are depressed relative to one another. This is all done by weft tensioning so that they can, in some cases, almost be on top of one another. As a result, the knot can be very compact, and you are then able to draw a much finer kind of a pattern, and you can actually get curvilinear structures. And this is sometimes referred to as a Persian or a Sena knot. All right, so then I thought I'd spend a few minutes describing what we might call the context of carpets, where under the circumstances, where are they and how are they produced? So of course they could be produced in a nomadic environment out in a camp. Typically that's going to be done on a ground loom. And the patterns will be traditional patterns. They can be complicated, but there are things that the weaver has seen many times before and are coming out of their immediate experience or tradition. The pieces that are woven will be used by the individuals for their own use, or they can be used for commerce. It's not uncommon to see these pieces showing up in the market and deliberately woven for that purpose. In the village, although certainly pieces are woven for personal use, you often see them woven for commercial purposes. It's a way for women, of course, in the first two contexts, nomadic and village, for them to augment income. And so every woman has to be a weaver in the traditional format. In the city, however, now you have workshops, and there is now a gender distinction. So in the nomadic and the village context, a woman is typically doing the weaving. That allows her to tend to children. This is a very traditional role. It's been going on for thousands of years. And that's sort of consistent with her duties as caring for children. In the city, however, and of course she's at home. In the city, the weaver has to leave wherever they're dwelling and come to a shop. And so typically men do that. Also in the city, the patterns now will often come from a detailed cartoon where the pattern is drawn out on graph paper and each knot is indicated. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then finally, as an upscale version of the workshop, in a court situation, the palace would often have their own workshops producing extremely high quality work for their purposes. And they would have designers who would draw out the pattern in advance, and it wouldn't necessarily be something they'd always done. It would be a new idea. So here's a photo of some workshop weavers. These are Indian weavers, and they're following a cartoon, as you can see up here. All this area up here has been drawn out on graph paper, and then below it, they're actually following that as they weave the rug. You'll also note that there's a bunch of them. So a big rug like this, say a 9x12 carpet, is not woven by a single individual. It's woven by several sitting side by side so that they can account for the span of what they can realistically work with. And as they move the yarns in and out of the warps, they then cut them with these knives. That'll leave a rather shaggy looking pile, and then they'll come back when the whole carpet is done and it'll be reclipped down to a fine pile. And the person who does that clipping is not the same person who does the weaving. in this context. They're specialists who are very good at just that job of clipping the carpet evenly. A good weaver, as I've noted here, can put in about 6,000 knots a day. This is all muscle memory by this time. Their hands are moving without them really having to think about it. And a 9x12 is going to take about 1.5 years with several weavers. Again, no single person weaves a 9x12 rug. So now let's consider the patterns and designs and where we get them. So some of them come right out of the grid nature of weaving. It sort of dictates design. You can easily imagine what sorts of patterns you might acquire from it. So here's an example here on the left of a Caucasian carpet. This would be woven in a village in the late 19th century. You can see blocks of color, fairly straightforward, simple patterning. There's nothing terribly complex in the pattern. This would be a Turkish knotted carpet and a long pile at that. On the right, you see a kilim, a flat woven piece from central Anatolia, also 19th century. And again, you can see geometric elements. This is a flat weave now. We don't see the warps because the wefts have been hammered down, so you can't see the wefts. But typically very geometric in patterning. And the piece behind me on the wall sort of is of that same ilk, although it's much earlier than this particular piece. Of course, floral elements are very important, and in the Middle East, particularly in arid environments, the idea of a garden and the floral elements associated with the garden is particularly important. And it is not surprising that the concept of paradise is really a garden. If you're living in an arid environment where an oasis is a welcome place, paradise is the garden in the oasis. And so we can see here on the right an example of a late 19th century carpet woven in Northwest Persia, very fancy, very floral. You can see very sinuous in its designing and drawing, very filled in, and this would have been done with a Persian knot, an asymmetric knot. Okay, now carpets have a layout. They have an architecture. What is that? And so we can see in a very early version of a carpet, I should say early to us, an example carved in stone. This is found in Nineveh, an ancient city, which is now in Iraq. And you can see the elements which persist today. A major border. Here you can see, and I'm going to spend more time on this element here, a floral vine element here, which is makes the composition of this primary border. You can see here. And then you can see a minor border consisting of these rosettes that you can see here. And then you can see an all over field pattern over and over and over again. It looks very monotonous, but interestingly enough, this idea of an overall pattern that just simply repeated itself in the field is very old and was really still see in our own time, but really dominated carpet designs for probably thousands of years. It was really very impressive how much it took hold in the imagination of the weavers and the people who were buying the weavings. Now here's another stone carpet from the same place. These are all around 640 or so BC. Here again, we can see this patterning of a floral and vine motif in the major border, the rosettes, and then in these squares, you can see another display of that flower. Now, what I want to point out here is that this is a side view of a flower. So typically in carpets, you see a side view or you see a top-down view. And here's a top-down view of the same floral element. Now it's been spread out. And we refer to this as a lotus pattern, a lotus flower. And it's a very important motif, which developed a long, long time ago, probably in Egypt. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute. Another old carpet comes to us from a tomb in the Altai Mountains near Siberia, which is the famous Pazyryk carpet, which was excavated in the late 40s and was preserved because that tomb, which was a large mound, which was a burial tomb, had flooded at some time, a long time ago. And because of the permafrost condition, the water had frozen. And so this carpet persisted for all these thousands of years because it was locked in ice. And when it came out, then it was in a rather good condition, as you can see here. But let's go over the organization of the rug. You can see a major outer border, as you can see here. Has minor borders on the very outside and interior here. Here's another minor border, a little more elaborate. And then we can see a central field of a repeating element. And if you'll notice, it's exactly the same repeating element that was in that field in the stone carpet in Nineveh. Of course, that carpet the stone carpet is a few thousand miles away and a few hundred years earlier. Now, let's take a closer look at this. The first thing I'd like to point out is that this is a pretty complicated rug in terms of its pattern and design and motifs. And so you don't invent weaving on Monday and then come in on Tuesday and decide to weave this rug. So probably people have been weaving for a couple thousand years to get all of this together, to get the sort of the design concepts together, to get the notion of a layout, to figure out just how to go about doing this. What we can see is borders that contain animals. Here are mounted horses, horsemen. These are probably some sort of an elk, which is probably Siberian in nature. Here you can see the edge of one of that top-down floral element, which is a little more geometricized now than you saw in the original stone carving. And down here we can see, again, this procession of horses. They turn the corner and they move up. So in order to set this out, the weaver has to actually have either roughly sketched it out, so he or she, probably a she, knows where she's going. Possibly she would have copied it from another rug. But if we look at it, and I come back to my point earlier when I started this presentation, let's look at this and address the question, was it made to a cartoon where every knot was called in advance? And the answer to that question is no. And the reason we know that is by looking down here at these two horses. You can see the length of this horse here. You all see that? Now let's take a look at the length of the horse here. And you can see it's truncated relative to this one. And the reason for that is that when the weaver got here, she realized she was running out of space. And so she had to make a decision. If she makes the horse the same size as the one before it, then she runs into the border and she's going to have a problem here. So she decided to truncate it. So now she can fit it into the space here and now continue on with this border unaffected. When you see that, and you will see it all the time, and particularly in village and nomadic weaving, you know right away, this is not to a cartoon. This is a weaver making decisions on the spot. And we can see here, 2,500 years later, exactly what decisions that weaver made. It's all written in the carpet if you know what to look for. Now, sometimes if you look at rugs, you'll see that the weaver will extend them, whatever the motif was here, and then just move on up whenever she can pick up the border pattern as it goes up the rug. But if you start looking, you'll begin to see that. Now, the text on this slide is really to emphasize that although there are a variety of patterns and motifs and so forth, that they're not necessarily unique to carpets and textiles, and that you can see them in a variety of different media, in architecture and tiles, painting, and so forth. And the other point I want to make, and I'll come back to this in a little while, is that the border should be seen not just as something that contains the elements within the field, but it has a larger significance in that it frames what is often viewed as an endless repeat. So when you look at rugs, and we'll talk about that, you begin to look at them now not as something you might consider in your own design work where I have a border and then I compress all of my design within that border. But in fact, what I have is a big design, which is extending infinitely, and I take the border and I frame an element, a portion of that design. Okay, and some, of course, these motifs are quite old and much older than Islamic art, even though carpets are a component of Islamic art. Okay, so where are the designs and what are they? So they fall into various categories, and I'm starting out with mineral, architectural motifs. And here's a splendid example of an Ottoman carpet from the 16th century, which is extremely architectural. So what you can see here are arches and columns. This is a mosque lamp, so this is a reflective a representation of a mosque, if you will. We call it a prayer rug, but it should be understood that the motivation for this is architectural. A pious Muslim can pray on any surface which protects him or her from the ground. And so here's an example of an architectural feature from the Alhambra, which is in southern Spain, the Moorish area. And you can see the arches and columns that appeared in that rug. And here's an example of a mosque lamp, very similar to the one here. You can go out and buy one of these today. These are still available. Another source of inspiration, of course, are simple geometric elements. And in that part of the world, these were used to form very complex looking patterns, particularly in tile work. So we'll take a look at some of that. So here's a very old example of mosaic patterning with tiles that are inserted into an architectural structure. This is 4000 BC, so you can see this is a pretty old idea. And here we see examples of tile from various sources. Roman theater in Syria, 2nd century AD. Here we are in Turkey, in Bursa, in the Green Mosque, which I've been to, and is actually quite a splendid structure. And you can see the various geometric elements worked from the tiles. And here's tile work from Uzbekistan and Samarkand. And here's a quite striking example of that work in the mosque in Samarkand. And you can see tiles covering the entire surface of the structure and presenting a variety of different pattern elements. And here is a carpet. This is from Turkey, probably 16th or 17th century, but an older pattern. And you can see elements that could come out of those tile patterns that I described a few minutes ago. We call these Holbein carpets, small pattern Holbein carpets. And the reason for that is that the painter, Hans Holbein, often depicted rugs of this type in his paintings. I should just say as an aside, there's a whole genre of paintings from this period in Europe in which carpets are depicted. Carpets were very prized as furnishings at that time. They were coming in from the Middle East, they were exotic, and they were for the wealthy. And the painters who were painting the portraits of the wealthy included them in their paintings. Now let's go back to the lotus flower. Here you can see, this is coming up in Egypt, 2400 BC. We can see an example of the flower, a side view. Now that became a very popular motif. It spread throughout the Mediterranean. It made its way into Greece. Alexander took it east, all the way into Afghanistan. And then from Afghanistan, it made its way into Western China. And we see here in Western China in a cave, now a top-down view of the lotus motif. And of course, as it moves from country to place to place, it's a symbol and it assumes the symbolic imagination of whatever the locals want to apply to it. And so it became a Buddhist symbol. It didn't start out as a Buddhist symbol because there wasn't any Buddhism when it started out, but by the time it gets to Western China, it's a Buddhist symbol. It's a picture. Okay, and then here's another example of it now on a side view. And this is a Timurid tile produced during the Timurid times. And here you can see it on a side view. And this tile work is actually visible. It's on display at the Sackler Museum in Washington, DC in the 15th century. It's quite an impressive piece of tile. We can also see it in a top-down view, that lotus spread out motif in the most famous carpet in the world called the Ardeville carpet. So that's made around 1540. This is a carpet which appears in two formats. That is to say, there were two of them were made at the same time. The more complete version is in London at the V&A Museum. And the reason it's more complete is that its sister was salvaged, used for salvage to reconstruct it. And what's left of that rug, the other one, is now in the Los Angeles County Museum in Los Angeles. Let me also note, as I've indicated here, this is a huge rug, 35 million knots, 3 years to complete, 10 people working on it. It's very large and very impressive. And here's a view, again, a close-up of that top-down view of that lotus element spread out, surrounded by floral elements, and these little bud-like elements all around it. And these, again, are reflective of some of the constructions that you see in the gardens. As you can see here, here's a fountain from the Alhambra. Again, that crenellated lotus top-down view has now become the basis of a fountain. Another floral element and way of presentation comes to us from the Mughals. This is a detail from the Taj Mahal. And you can see these naturalistic flowering plants. Notice there's always a little bit of earth from which they spring. That's often the case. Here are 2 carpets from the Mughal period in India. These are gorgeous and very highly prized. They'd be unimaginably expensive if they came on the market. Here you can see the floral elements now in a lattice construction. So each one is contained within an element formed by this lattice. The lattice idea also transmits over into Ottoman Turkey. And here's a fragment of a kaftan, which is a garment that the sultans would have worn. It's a very complex weave. Someday Kartika can explain to you how it's woven. Too complicated for me to go into now. But again, you can see this notion of what we call an ogival lattice, which contains these floral elements. And the Ottomans really prized this concept of the flowers, as did the Mughals, of course, as well. And they used these as branding elements so that these flowers were associated with the mark of the empire, tulips in particular. Now let's look at a very complex weave, a very complex patterning. This is a Safavid vase carpet from the 17th century. And I want to call your attention to a few elements here. First of all, we see a top-down flower here, as you can see, and there's another top-down flower over here. But we can also see side view flowers, as you can see here. These are sometimes referred to as palmettes, and they represent a floral element that's been basically squashed down, and you can see it now from the side. What connects these is a vine assembly. Let's see if I can find my cursor here. There we go. All right, let's just trace one of these vines. So we'll start down here with this top-down element here, top-down flower. The vine comes up here. We're going to take the right turn. There's another little side view of a smaller flower, which has been squashed down on the side. And the vine continues down here until it picks up this other floral element. But you notice right here, where my cursor is, that there's another one coming and appears on either side. And that vine is connecting a floral element here and one up here. What you can see here is that the vine that is emanating from this turquoise top-down flower, dominates this one. So it's on top of it. And so we refer to this as a 2-plane lattice system. And you'll often see this. The rugs look incredibly complicated. What are all those swirling lines? But if you trace them out, what you see is that the one will dominate the other. That is to say, you see the one color on top of the other. And then you know right away that that's the top lattice. And then there's one below it. And there might even be a third one below that. Okay, so I'm showing this rug again because now we see a main border element. This is a vine and floral construction here on the white ground. And what we can see up here is a country version of the naturalistic flowers that the Mughals presented. So this is a very beautiful version of that in a nomadic or a village concept woven by Turkmen weavers in the 18th century. Now the motif, which is the repeating element in the center, we call that a gul, sometimes referred to as which means flower. And I'll have a little more to say about that in a few minutes. We started the talk with the saz leaf carpet, the sickle leaf carpet, and here you see a blow up of that. This is from that rug. Here's the serrated leaf, the detail from the Corcoran. And this is actually a motif that emerges in Central Asia in 6th or 7th century AD. but then makes its way throughout the entire weaving world, became very popular. And you see it in all sorts of formats. For example, here in tile, Iznik tile in Ottoman Turkey. You can see here, this is a two-plane lattice. You can see the sickle cell leaf is now on top of the vine below it, the vine connecting the floral elements. And I wanted to call your attention to a concept of a specific designer. So Karamemi was a famous court designer of his time, and we know his name and we associate him with certain designs. And here's a very splendid example. Again, an Ottoman product from the 17th century. This is a velvet. It's not a carpet, it's a velvet, silk velvet. And it displays not only the saz leaves, the serrated leaves, as you see here, but also some of the other branding elements of the empire. Here's the carnation, and here are tulips right here. It's a tulip. The reason this looks kind of grayed out here is because it was originally silver thread, which has corroded and become gray. And when you actually look at this, you can just see little flecks of the original silver. Another motif that you'll encounter is the central medallion. Here, you can see it right here. I'll also call your attention to an element here in the border, which I'll touch on in just a second. So these carpets, this patterning became very, very popular. Based, we think, on earlier designs which come out of book covers. So Qurans were often covered with these very fancy covers. They were inscribed in leather and so forth, and tooled in gold and silver and very fancy materials. And what you can see here is a central medallion and these lobes around it. I'll also call your attention to this element up here in each of the corners. What would that be? Before I tell you, let me point out that there's a painting, a Timurid painting with a central medallion carpet. So this appears around that time. All right, so now let's address that question I just raised. So here we see a huge rug. This rug is probably 30 feet long. It's a Ushak carpet from the Ottoman period. These were court rugs. You can see here a huge central medallion. And now, somewhat like the element I pointed out to you in the book cover, you can see what appears to be a fragment of some sort of a medallion. Now, if you let your mind go on this, you can see that it's actually half, and the other half is over here. The same as here and here and here. And what you're looking at is a framing by this border of an infinite repeat. The infinite repeat consists of two elements. This oval central medallion here, and this more crenellated central medallion up here. And they will alternate across for an infinity. And so this has a sort of this mystical quality of the carpet framing the universe. And this, you get to see a little part of that universe. Another popular theme refers to animals in carpet design. And these obviously come out of a very old experience of the cultures because they lived with animals, both domestic and wild. And an old motif is animal combat. And we see this in early stone carving from Mesopotamia. I'll show you in just a second. But before you take, before you reflect on your own sympathies for the animal that's being attacked and about to be devoured, I should point out to you that these combat motifs actually come out of a symbolism. Whereas the lion, for example, is regarded as a sun symbol, and the bull of the earth is regarded as a mark of the dark. And so this is a contest between light and dark, as you can see here. Of course, the motif becomes very popular. It spreads throughout the area. And here you see it in a Safavid rug, where now two carnivores are attacking an unfortunate herbivore. The herbivore is not going to come out of this very well. But again, you see this is a very common theme and symbiology that you see in rugs from this time and actually into our own time. Now in China, the use of the animal imagery, particularly the dragon, is a little different. So in China, the dragons are actually benign creatures. We may think of them as fears, but they're actually considered to be benign, and they were taken on as a symbol by the emperor, as a symbol of power, but also of his goodwill towards the people. The other symbol, which is also often associated with the dragon, is the phoenix. And this is often, as I mentioned, paired, and it was taken on as a symbol of the empress. So you often see a dragon and phoenix motif. Now, what's interesting is that that's a motif cast in benign terms in China. But when it makes its way into Persia, the Persians then apply their own interpretation to it. And now it becomes an example of an animal combat. And what you see here is a dragon, which is now in combat with the phoenix. The Chinese wouldn't recognize this. They'd recognize the motif, but not the intention. But this is very Persian in its conception. And this, by the way, is from a very well-known silk kilim from the Safavid period, which is in the Textile Museum collection. Animals, of course, get stylized as they move into the country, into the village. And here you can see a very stylized version of the dragon motif. And we refer to these carpets as dragon carpets. They come out of the Caucasus in the 17th and the 18th century. Well, it's also true, of course, that although animals are popular, they don't necessarily have to be fighting with each other. And here we see animals in roundels. This comes out of the Sogdian period in the 6th and 7th century AD. This becomes this idea of a roundel with animals in it becomes immensely popular. And it spreads throughout the weaving world. You see this notion from China all the way into Turkey. This is a good example of a pattern that just became very, very commercially favored. And so here are two examples of it in garments, the full garment here you can see here, and a detail from one that's in the Abeg in Switzerland. Now, when you try to move a complex pattern like that into a nomadic or village type of environment, necessarily the motif has to become simplified. And so what you can see here is that circular roundel has now become an octagon with much more rectilinear presentation. And the animals, of course, become very simplified, and they also become much more rectilinear. But the conception, this, is exactly what motivated this. And the Turkoman carpet that I showed you earlier, those goals are actually simplifications that come right out of the much earlier format, these roundels that will fill a field. Here's an example of what we call a cloud band. I called your attention to that motif in one of the earlier carpets. That's a Chinese motif, and it also became extremely popular and spread throughout the weaving world. And here we can see it in an Iznik tile in 1578 in Turkey. And you can see it here in a detail from the Ardabil carpet. All right, so now let's go back and take another look at that sickle cell rug that I introduced earlier. Well, you have a border, and the border is framing the field. Let's just take a look at some of these elements that appear to be trapped by the border. You can see one right here. So this is a partial flower. The reason it's a partial flower, as is the one up here, is not because the weaver ran out of room or didn't know what he was doing. This would have been done in a fancy workshop. It's because this was a deliberate design, and the border is framing an endless repeat and has trapped one of these, actually all of these floral elements, in half. That's what that means. It's not because the weaver didn't know what they were doing. You also see, of course, the sickle cell, the saz leaves, as we call them, which gave rise to the name of the rug. Side view of a flower, top down of a flower. And then these vines. And you can see again, we're dealing with now a lattice system, one on top of the other. So as you start to look at this, you can deconstruct the layering and the designing that goes into this carpet. You'll see these kinds of elements in rugs that are woven today, particularly the ones that come out of this more fancy floral tradition. But even in village weaving, you will see one element on top of another. And again, you're dealing with a two-plane structure, even though the weaver may not have actually understood that that's what she was doing. She was just copying another rug that somebody put in front of her. Okay, so I thought we could take a little break at this point. I have some more things to discuss when we talk about decorative rugs. But if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything, this would be a good time to do that. And then we can move on to the next part.
Michael.
So should I stop sharing?
Yeah, just stop sharing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. So there were several questions. So maybe we can address some of them and then go on.
Sure.
Catherine wants to know what you mean by cartoon and if that is a pattern template. And we talked a little bit in the chat about it. It's a pattern on a graph paper, I told her. And then Elizabeth contributed an online link to cartoons, but maybe you would like to speak about it.
Yes, so actually in workshops like that, there are two ways that the pattern is transmitted to the weavers. I just showed you the one where you have a drawn out pattern. So a designer drew that out. There are professional designers that do that. Nowadays they probably use a computer, but in the old days they would get a graph, what effectively amounted to graph paper with carefully ruled little squares, each one representing a knot. And then they would draw out the pattern, and the pattern would then be transmitted to the shop. But there's another way to transmit the information to the weavers, particularly if you're weaving more than one rug at a time. And that's by calling the knots. So there would be professionals who would have in their hands a set of instructions for every knot in the rug. And they would call the knots. So they'd start at the very, say, left side of the rug at the very base, and they'd say red. And the weaver there would put in a red knot. And then the call would be for a green. And then the next call would be for a yellow or whatever it was. And they would just go across, and following the weave, of course, you have to go across before you put in the next series of wefts, and the knots would be called. These rugs were often woven in pairs. So two teams would be weaving side by side. And there's an interesting story that John Thompson told us on one of his lectures to us a number of years ago, where he had found two rugs that were identical, or apparently identical, and he had put them side by side, and he'd inspected them very carefully, and he had found that there was, well, between the two, there was one place where the knots were not the same. And the reason for that was that the weaver made a mistake at that point. So if the knot caller changes the pattern, in other words, if you anticipate that this flower is going to have a red knot there, but it actually has a green one, and that flower in both rugs, both of the sister rugs, have the green dot instead of what it should have been red, then the knot caller made the mistake. But if only one of the rugs has the mistake, then the weaver made the mistake. It's a very nice little bit of insight.
Now, this is pertaining especially to the workshops in Persia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they...
well, wherever, but typically we associate that with Persian workshops.
Yeah, Oriental and Persia. And I'd also heard about vagires or samplers. Would you like to tell them about that?
So those are rugs that that have the motifs that you would have in a rug. So in one of these samplers, which might be 3 feet by 4 feet or something like that, that's a fairly good sized one. They might be smaller. The weaver would weave a top-down flower, a side view flower, a cloud band, and whatever other motifs they might be employing in the rug. And then the salesman would basically say to whoever was going to be the customer, well, you can have a rug with these motifs, and this is how they would be drawn out and how they would be displayed. And so there's a whole subgroup of collectors who collect vagaries, samplers, and they come in a variety of sizes and from different locations and so forth.
Thank you. Now, Sue wanted to know, what is the content of the warp? Is it equivalent to of what we call carpet warp? And so I told her that
Yeah,
There are various, right? Yeah.
yeah. So warps can be, depending on the place and the nature of production, they can be of wool. They can be of undyed wool from sheep. And so sometimes you get brown warps and off-white warps and so forth. Sometimes they're all white. Sometimes it might have been either selected from a white fleeced sheep, or occasionally they'll be even bleached, which will actually diminish their strength. But they can be of wool. So typically you'll see that in country village type weaving where sheep are available, and that's part of the life of those people. They can be of cotton, so you have to have access to cotton. Cotton's a commercial item, so typically you're going to have to buy cotton. A village weaver isn't making her own cotton, but she will spin her own wool. And they can be silk. So fancy rugs are often have silk warps, sometimes silk wefts, the very fanciest. So the high end, really high end production can be on silk. And sometimes you see silk as a component of just the weaving if they want to upscale the piece. We just acquired an 18th century kilim from Anatolia, which has some silk in the wefting, but the rest of the warping is wool.
So they used uh, silk for a kilim. That's quite unusual, right?
Yes, it is unusual. You do see silk highlights in Turkmen weaving, particularly in the later 19th century. It's a fancy, it's a mark of a more expensive piece.
I see. Okay. Okay. So, and then she was also interested, and then you did mention Karamemi. So she says, did weavers and designers become famous, and can you trace carpets by designs and weaving quality?
Yeah. So in the Ottoman court, they were registered and they knew about them. Yeah. So some of them were quite famous. Um, in Iran, there are some names that you will sometimes see associated with the carpet, Mohtasham, for example. But the problem, of course, is that once a name gets applied to an expensive rug, the next time a rug comes along, that name is going to be applied. So as soon as the trade gets their hands on a name like that, they're going to use it. So if somebody says to you, this is a Mohtasham Kashan, it doesn't mean that Mohtasham actually had anything to do with it. It might have been made long after he was gone, but nonetheless, you're trying to associate an expensive rug with an expensive name. But the Turks in particular kept meticulous records. So we know a lot about who designed what at the high end. Now the other point, and I guess this is a point I'll make in the next part of the talk, is that designs flow in both directions. So early on, a long, long time ago, the designs start presumably in the country when weaving is developed and people start weaving these things and trying to mimic an animal skin by developing a pile format. Eventually you get into cities and towns and so forth, and you get a more settled production. And when you get to the notion of trends and what's popular and what's faddish and so forth, what begins to dominate the commercial life, then those patterns now trickle back out into the village and into the nomadic environment. So you'll see the village version of what was a high-end piece. It's much simplified, of course, but the design now has come back into the village. So for example, a central medallion idea that's emanating originally from a book cover, which then becomes a magnificent ushak carpet. Well, you'll see plenty of central medallion motifs in village weaving. They get that out of the city. They didn't bring it out of themselves. That's a very common back and forth. You see that a lot.
Yeah. And of course, weavers, we never know who they are, right?
That's correct. We do not know who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Meredith says, can you enlarge on the technique of hammering the weft in the kilim?
Yes. So the technique for hammering is pretty much the same. There's a comb-like structure. And depending on the style of the weaving, it's used to, you stick it between and just pound it down. So sometimes it's just pounded down. You actually can go out and buy these things. They're out in the market. You can get a nice 19th century device for pounding down knots. Um, Depending on the nature and the local custom, the pounding will be more or less aggressive. So kilims are, they're okay. They're reasonably finely done. But something like a Bijar carpet, which is from Northwest Iran, these are famous for being pounded in with a hammer on top of that comb. And so we call them iron rugs because they're so tough, extremely heavy. An enormous amount of wool has been packed into those rugs.
And they last forever.
They last for a very long time. That's
So
right.
you're talking about a beater. You're not talking about taking a hammer after.
No, I'm talking about hammering down the beater. So you've got a comb-like structure. You
Okay.
insert that into the warp system on top of the knots.
Oh, okay.
Then you come in and pound it
Understand.
down. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Sue says, I'm fascinated by the carpet in the Clark collection. The border is symmetrical, but the field is asymmetrical. Is the field telling a story or describing a scene, like a painting?
No, it's really, that's the imagination of a designer who has drawn all that out. Now, as you think about some of these elements, I've alluded sort of obliquely to symbolism. So there are symbols and there are symbols. So the lotus blossom, for example, and its various formats and presentations has symbolic value depending on what culture you're discussing. So I mentioned it as a Buddhist symbol in China and in Buddhist tradition. It would have been thought of as something else, obviously, before there were Buddhists. There was a lotus pattern and a lotus symbol. So when you look at the rug, the weaver may or may not assign a symbolic value to that. Let's say a 19th century weaver dealing with a motif that's been in that culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. She may only know that they've been using it for a long time. She may know what name they give it. And she, there may be her grandmother may have said, well, this means such and such. But they're subject to change. So that's one way of looking at them. And then there's, of course, what the dealers tell you and the dealer stories. So here you have to be very thoughtful about what you accept. Because I'm going to tell you a little story that was recounted by a well-known dealer who happened to be in a shop in Afghanistan many years ago when Westerners could go freely to Afghanistan. And he was in the shop and a carpet was being sold to some tourists, a young couple. And the carpet was of the sort that had been woven in two parts and then sewn together. Occasionally this happens. And the owner, the shopkeeper, was informing the tourists that this had been woven by the village of the groom and the other half had been woven by the village of the bride and had been joined together to commemorate their wedding. And after of course, the young couple were delighted, they bought the piece and took it home with a wonderful story. And then the well-known dealer said to the owner of the shop, where did you get that idea? That's complete nonsense. I've never heard of that before. And he said, yes, I just made it up. He said, the carpet costs, but the story is free.
Excellent.
That's right. So we often see motifs in rugs which are given names by the trade that have nothing to do with the original idea. For example, that sickle cell pattern motif that you see in Kurdish weaving and other weavings. I have a nice Kurdish rug which has a village version of that sickle cell motif. That is called in the trade a shish kebabi motif, after shish kebab, because it looks like you stuck a bunch of things on a skewer and before you put it into the fire. Yes, exactly. That's absolutely nothing to do with the original conception of a serrated leaf. But there you are. That's the dealer lore for it. And so a dealer will have a conversation. Let's say I've got this one in a shish kebabi motif, and you have to know what that means. And you might know that what he's just said is complete nonsense, but it is a useful way of transmitting the idea of a particular motif.
Yeah, it's the same when you go to museums, especially museums or ancient monuments, at least in India, we always have these self-appointed guides who come up and who give you all sorts of, explanations.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
very often they are romantic and they cook up all these wonderful, just like this, two sides to one thing, and then they are joined in love, whatever. Yeah, I think one has to be discerning. Okay, let's go on. Alison has a question. Michael, you explained how the pile format evolved. Can you repeat that, please?
So probably the earliest rugs were animal skins. And of course, they have the tactile quality of fur, for example, or a fleece. But once you get into the notion of being able to domesticate an animal that can provide a fiber that you can then use for the purpose of whatever, weaving, etc., making garments or carpets, then you actually have to think to yourself, now what's more useful? Should I kill the animal and get one rug from the animal? Or should I actually be able to harvest something from that animal over and over and over again and essentially keep my capital intact and make use of a product from the animal? So you can see that some clever person a long time ago thought, well, maybe this is a better approach and makes a bit more sense in economic terms. Get more use out of this particular item, this particular animal. So the anticipation, the thinking is that the derivation of pile really is an effort to mimic fur or a coat, and gives you, and I think that's probably one of the aspects that lends itself to it's kind of the romance of the field. The fact that it is not simply a visual medium, but it's actually a tactile medium, and it has kind of a furry quality to it, I think actually speaks to something that's sort of fundamental to us. There's a certain comfort in that kind of tactile sensation. And I think that's one of the reasons it has developed this kind of romantic quality. And so the dealers who work in the trade, particularly you talk to the old guys who've been around for a long time, this is a material they really are invested in. They see this without being able to articulate it, perhaps, nonetheless, is something that is more than just a product that they're selling. This is something that's the work of the hand. It has an ancient tradition, and it has still with it not only a design element that's very old and continuous. It defines the villages they might have come from, or their ancestors might have come from, but also contains with it still that tactile quality, in addition to being this exercise in composition and color and form. So it's quite a remarkable art form.
And then to continue on that topic, Michael, I love your Kashan rugs. Do tell them about the Kashan rugs and the whole thing about this tactile, the wool.
Yes, so I'll actually touch on that in the next section. And what I will do, since I have one hanging on the wall right around the corner, and when I get to that, I'll pick up the computer and we'll go take a look at that.
So before we go on, just one last question, and I've put down a few points as well. We can talk about it after you do the next round of slides, but just this one last thing, if you'd like, we can just start talking about it, or else we can do this along with the Kashan rug. Maureen says, can you tell us about the piece behind you? What makes it special for you?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yes. So what's interesting about this piece behind me, let's see if we can get a little closer to it.
Yeah.
Is that a little more apparent?
Yes.
So this is a fragment. It's from the 17th century from central Anatolia. Kilims of this type are often quite long, and they're often woven in two long parts, and then they're sewn down the middle. What you're seeing here is a half of a half. So what you might imagine is that the kilim, which had been sewn down the middle, was separated at some time, and then it was cut in half again. So there actually are a total of 4 pieces that would have amounted to this particular piece. It's not uncommon to find now out in the market these kinds of fragments that are particularly with kalim. Sometimes you see just the half, the long half, and sometimes you'll see them reduced further. So that's an example of this. This is from the 17th century. And the coloration is one of the features of it that tells you, well, we're roughly in this time period. So when you get to know an area of weaving, like Anatolia, where you can find old pieces, it's very, you don't find old pieces in Iran, for example, but you do find them in Anatolia. Then you begin to realize how much variability there is in the coloration, depending on the region of the country you're in, and also the age of the piece. And so it's common for the dealers to say 18th century color. They'll just point at it and they'll say, yeah, that's an 18th century color. This is a color this is a red you only see in the 17th century, and so on. It's very interesting when you get into that aspect of it. And so particularly when you're talking to people who know this very well. But that's another something, Kartika and I have discussed this, throughout throughout all over the textile world, you see that the use of dye on a fiber is rather common. And the very same color, blue, let's say, or red, coming from madder as a source, will have a different flavor depending on the location in the region. So madder in Turkey is not going to look the same as it does in Iran. Kurdish colors are not the same as what you'd find in central Anatolia, and so on. So after a while, you begin to recognize a palette that you can associate with a particular region and location.
And you were mentioning the pH.
Oh, yes, I should tell you that story. Okay, so just a second.
So while we wait for Michael, if you see, look at the motifs. The motif in this kilim are all the same, but just different colorways, right?
That's right.
Anyway,
Okay.
carry on. Yeah.
So this is a hat. This is an embroidered hat. And there's one behind me over here somewhere. Yeah. Okay. So this hat is contemporary. This hat was embroidered in Armenia within the last 10 or 15 years. 10 years, I'd say. It's being produced by a consortium of Armenian embroiderers in a bunch of different Armenian villages in the country of Armenia. And this is all being organized by an Istanbul carpet dealer whom we know very well. And it's a very interesting story, so I'm going to tell it to you. So he started doing this a number of years ago, and he's just kind of worked out a theme. He brings to the villages cotton on which he has drawn, or his designers have drawn a pattern. And then he has silk that he imports from Central Asia. He said he gets better silk there than he does from China. And he has it dyed in Istanbul. And I have met his dyers. So I had a long conversation via the interpreting done by our friend, the dealer, by Mehmet Çetinkaya, with one of these dyers. And this is a very, very bare bones operation. He has a propane heater out in the alley, a big tank of a big kettle really, and boiling water, and he's throwing dye into it. And when that's been solubilized, he then dips in the silk. And we had a long discussion about the pH problem, because he couldn't control the pH of the Istanbul water. And depending on the pH, he gets a different flavor of color for the very same dye stuff, which are all natural vegetable-derived dyes. And this is a real problem if you're trying to quality control your product, because you can't do that. It's very tough. And so from that, you get this idea, well, there may have been a shift in the pH or the mineral content of the water in this particular region. Maybe it was this in the 17th century, and maybe there was a landslide which now flooded it with debris and rock, et cetera, which is going to change the composition of the water. And thus you're going to have a different flavor and hue and tone to the dyes when they take onto the fibers. very, very illuminating discussion. What he's doing, of course, is what people have been doing for thousands of years, heating some container of water, throwing a dye stuff in it, and then dipping in whatever fiber it is they're trying to dye, and getting back what they get back.
We have just been experimenting with indigo, Michael.
Yep.
We are all from various different.
Yes. And I would expect you would get a different result.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about indigo is I was in a shop in Istanbul a couple of years ago, and I looked at a rug which was in the design of a 16th century Uşak carpet. So it would have been extremely valuable and expensive if it was a 16th century Uşak carpet in that design. And I looked at it, and the blue was not right. I was very puzzled by it. So I asked my friend who owned the shop, I said, what is that? Because I was very puzzled by it. And he said, oh, you know, that's a fake by the famous faker who was operating in the early 20th century. He said, you never see that blue in an old carpet.
Yes, there were lots of, that's a whole other topic, right? We had a full presentation about fakes, and very good fakes at that.
Oh, yeah. Right, yeah, there are very good fakes being done now.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good fakes. So I'll show you one more piece that's on the wall here, on the other wall. So this now here, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is an 18th century fragment kilim. Again, exactly a half of a half. This color, that's an 18th century color right there.
Mm-hmm. It's like a peach.
Yes, it's a particular flavor, and you really don't see it after that. You don't see it well into the 19th century. And the later 19th century colors become very muddy. They really don't have the clarity of the earlier material.
Interesting. Oh, there's one more question. How long is this presentation? I'd like to see the rest of it. Okay, so let's carry on. This is from one of my students.
Somebody who wants us to leave?
No, she wants to see the rest of it, but she's running into dinner time. Catherine, get your dinner and sit with us. But let's, shall we continue? And
okay, so I'm going to share the screen again.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see, here we are. Do I see that? I don't see it.
It's black for now.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
No.
No, okay.
Just click on your down button instead.
Okay, now I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay, so this section is on decorative rugs and the whole notion of a decorative rug in the West. So as I mentioned earlier, carpets were prized, Middle Eastern carpets were prized in Europe. They were very popular. They made their way into the palaces and the houses of the wealthy. And you often see them depicted in paintings. And so here's an example of Henry VIII standing on an Anatolian rug. And this is painted by the younger Holbein. And so, as I say, they were often used in this format. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole genre of painters who painted pictures that included carpets. And I should also note that they are often not seen on the floor. They're often seen as on tables or desks and so forth. They're not necessarily thought of as floor coverings the way we have come to think of them now. And here's a famous photo that I think you may have seen previously because you had a talk from one of the rug dealers in New York. This is Sigmund Freud's studio. And what you can see here, he was quite a collector, by the way. He had a lot of rugs. On the back wall, you can see a rug from Central Anatolia from the 19th century. Here you can see what's become a famous Southwest Persian carpet, quite long, and 3 medallions, and a white ground border. And on the floor, you can see a furnishing rug, a room-size furnishing rug that would have been very popular at this time in Europe and in the United States. And I'll mention a rug of this sort in a few minutes. You can also see some bags and smaller pieces. This one in particular has terrible color. So I think Freud had good taste for some, but actually didn't quite understand that one in particular. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so after the sort of boom, if you will, of interest in carpets in the 16th, 17th century in Europe, the taste changed and fell off a bit. And so when we come into the 18th and early first part of the 19th century, it really wasn't a very strong commercial item. But then there was an exhibition in Vienna in 1873, and they put on carpets on display, and that revitalized the interest. And so there became a second wave, if you will, of interest in carpets and using them for furnishing purposes in Western homes. Now, there was also, coincident with that, a lot of interest in the Orient. And so the Orientalist painters became very popular and famous, and they often depicted scenes of the Orient, some of them quite fanciful, but they would display carpets and textiles. This is an example of an embroidered piece that would come out of Central Asia. We call them Suzanis, but very, very splashy, a very impressive piece. These paintings, by the way, are extremely expensive now. And so the carpets became very popular. Here's a photo of a Victorian interior where you can see that rugs are all over the place. And these were produced, as I'll get to in just a minute, really for the purpose of furnishing these houses. So, for example, the Ziegler Company set up production in northern Iran. And other companies came into the area as well, and they would set up production. They would employ weavers in villages or set up workshops. And they would tell them, okay, we want this many 9x12s or 4x7s or whatever it was. And by the way, our customers like these patterns, and they're not very happy about those patterns. So that really had an enormous influence on the kinds of pieces that were being produced for the Western market. And as you can see from this note here, there were well over 2,000 looms from this company by 1900. Iran was one of the major centers for this production, and you can see some of the names that are still applied to carpet. So it's often the case that a carpet would be given the name of the location where it was woven. Now, if something is said to be from Kerman, which is in southeast Iran, it doesn't mean it was woven in the city of Kerman. It might have been woven in a village in the environment, in the area of Kerman, but it might have been actually traded and commercially handled in that city. Same with Shiraz. So that long rug on Sigmund Freud's couch is from the area around Shiraz. It's from one of the tribal groups around Shiraz. We see Kashan. Kartika mentioned Kashan, another city. Up here is Isfahan's, Hamadan's. Bijar, that's the iron rug that I mentioned to you, that's associated with the village weaving around the town of Bijar. And Hariz, which is still a very popular rug for furnishing today. Now, in Russia and the Russian territories, the czars, towards the end of the 19th century, took an interest in the traditional crafts, and they set up what were called the Kustari industries, and these were designed to encourage and support the continuation and the perpetuation of the traditional crafts, woodworking or metal or whatever, but including carpets. And so these actually became pretty popular, and they were, carpets in particular were produced in large amounts. They became items of trade. So it was one way for the village people, if you will, to make something that was saleable, and there was a market in the West. And then when the Soviets took over, they needed money. So they confiscated everything they could get their hands on, and they sold it off to the West. So an enormous number of pieces come into the West, to Europe and to the United States in that particular context. And the weaving in those areas, you have the Caucasian carpets. I showed you a Star Kazakh, Kazakh being located right here early in the talk. And there are other, again, towns that we associate with particular carpets, Kuba, Baku, Talish, etc., Dagestan. these named places will often be assigned to a carpet. And the Turkmen weaving groups, again, I've shown you a Turkmen carpet. And these were assembled, these are produced by various subgroups of the overall Turkmen tribal entities, the Yomud tribe, the Teki. Tekis are very well known. We'll point out one in a minute. Or sorry, Sarik and so forth. So again, here in contrast to the place name attribution, here we have more of a tribal entity attribution. Okay, so here's an example of a Ziegler Mahal, Mahal being a town. And this is an example of a soft coloration and designing that was popular in the European market. You wouldn't see this rug in a traditional production from if you'd gone back to circa 1800. This is designed to present motifs that are understood by the weavers, are appreciated by the West, but in a color format and a softer format that was more pleasing to the Western eye. Here's that saruk I showed you earlier. These are splendid carpets. They're very, very wonderfully woven, and they're finely woven. So these are high quality pieces. Now here's something that we call the American saruk. In the 20s, early in the 20s, one particular person, rug dealers in New York City, decided that they would design a rug for the American taste. And so they sent off to Iran, to northern Iran and around Saruk, that northern area, a patterning which had these isolated floral elements on a red, usually red, but sometimes a blue ground. Now, the weavers in that area had never woven anything quite like that, but hey, you know, they're being paid to do this, so that's what they did. And so these became known as the American saruk because of their popularity in the United States. And they became immensely popular. So anybody's grandmother or great-grandmother might very well have had one of these rugs. There was an issue, however. And the issue was that as woven, the colors were too bright for the American taste. So they were brought into New York and then they were bleached. So that knocked back the colors. But there was a problem associated with that. The reds didn't survive the bleaching. So they would then go back in and somebody would actually sit on the rug and with a dye pot and some sort of a pen device would then recolor every single red shoot, every single red knot. And you can tell that that's happened because when you look at the base of the knot, it will be lighter than the top of the knot. If you have a carpet that has been exposed to the sun and the color has faded because of that, the color at the top of the knot will be lighter than at the base. So if you have a dark base and a light top, I'm sorry, if you have a dark top and a light base, that's a good example of a painting. So and sometimes the painting didn't work quite so well, or they were a little sloppy and they missed something. Remarkably, the painted saruks, sort of a subgenre, turned out to be very hardy and durable carpets. You can still run across them. But I should also point out that although they were immensely popular, and even into the 1960s, if you went into a carpet store, that and one other rug that I'll mention in a minute were the stock in trade. Nobody wants these now. They've completely fallen out of favor. So if you like them, this is a fabulous time to buy a 9x12 saruk. You can get it for nothing. Okay. Now here's the Kashan that Kartika was mentioning. So Kashan had been traditionally a location for weaving shawls. But the European shawl production, which was designed to compete with both Indian and Persian shawl production, was very successful and it undercut the production of shawls by these weavers. And so they didn't really know what to do. And so the story is that they then turned to carpet weaving. And what's interesting here, and this is what Kartika alluded to, this is a classic example of a Western entrepreneur supporting and supplying the materials for the weaving which is done in Iran. So wool was brought in, merino wool was brought in from Australia, and then it was processed in Manchester, England, and then it was sent into Iran, to Kashan, to the weavers who would then weave these carpets. They're then, as a result, called Manchester Cashans. And they are characterized by a tremendous, beautiful, glossy wool, a very wonderful handle. It's a very soft, rich handle, and a very fine weave. It's going to be a little difficult for you to see this. But this is a Manchester Cashan right here. This is a dark rug. I have a somewhat lighter one that's packed away. But as you can see, if you were to see the back, it's extremely finely woven and has a wonderful handle. And here is a pattern that never would have been woven in the 18th century, but consists of a mixture of various motifs, some of which we've discussed. I know, for example, that Kartika has discussed a botte pattern with you, and here you see it in this carpet. And you can see these floral elements spread out here, the vine tracing that you can see along in here. Yep, okay, good. And then we come to the haris. So these are very popular and were very popular. They're big, bold patterns. Again, they're making use of motifs that would have been used in earlier production, but are designed and specific for the Western audience. This is an example of a late 19th century piece. Here's one that would have been produced around 1900. You can see the ideas there, but we're getting a shift in sort of emphasis of pattern elements. They're often based on this idea of a central medallion motif, but not necessarily. Sometimes you see them in all over patterns. And then here's one from the 1930s. Again, you may have encountered these in a house, your own or somebody else's. Very popular and still popular. Now let's discuss Kerman. So the product that was being made in the late 19th century, here we see a central medallion motif. Very floral, very fancy, a very characteristic palette, much more of this cochineal type purplish red here than you would see in other carpets, certainly not in the harises. So this would have been something you would have acquired in the late 19th century. But it changed. And by the mid 20th century, there became popular what we call the ivory kerman. So this now has changed very radically from that original carpet. This carpet would have had a very low pile in order to emphasize the patterning. But this carpet had a very thick pile. So it was very, very pleasant to walk on. But the design has just been completely changed relative to the original 19th century version. Ivory kermans, along with the American Saruk, were the stock and trade for decades in the rug business. So if you were buying them in the 50s or the 60s or even into the 70s, that's what you would have been shown by the dealer, and that's what everybody wanted. This went well with gilded French, whatever, period furniture, the idea of an opulent presentation. But like the American Saruk, these have completely collapsed. Nobody wants them. So if you like the ivory kerman, this is a fabulous time to go out and buy an ivory kerman. Every dealer has a few of them. Every dealer will welcome you very handsomely if you come in and say, this is what you're looking for. Okay, so that is those kinds of carpets. Now let's move to some of the other production. So the Caucasian rugs that you see here, this is a Kazakh. These were also very popular. They're very strongly colored, relatively simpler in patterning. The patterns are derived from the Anatolian designs that come out of the Anatolian villages, but they're simplified, and the colors are much stronger and more intense than you would see in the equivalent Anatolian product. And over here is a sumac, which is a kind of a flat weaving, and these were also produced in a floor covering format. Here's one that contains some elements that you would have seen on much earlier dragon carpets. And these also come out at about the same time. Now, sumac as a weaving technique is also used in villages and in nomadic context to make bags and carrying devices, but that's not what this is. This is actually designed as a floor covering or perhaps as a wall hanging. And then we look at some of the Turkoman rugs. So this is a techie from the Techie Weaving Group, Turkoman carpet. This was woven for commerce. This was intended to be sold. And you can see these all over the place. These are extremely common in the Western market. Then in the 20s and 30s, for a brief period of time, coincident with the Art Deco period, two entrepreneurs went into China and set up weaving production there. And they changed the iconography altogether. They would use Chinese symbols, but in a presentation that no Chinese person would have ever recognized or embraced for that matter. They used wild colors and a display of the format that was very dramatically different from a traditional Chinese iconography. But actually they have their own charm, and I quite like some of them. They're so over the top that they can be really intriguing and interesting. So we call these Art Deco Chinese, and this particular type was from the Nichols Company. And the other group, the Fete Company, made a somewhat more subdued version of again, a patterning that reflects Chinese symbols, but wouldn't have been done by traditional Chinese weaving. I should also point out that Chinese rugs were produced over hundreds of years. But for the most part, China was a silk culture. And if you look at paintings, say ancestor portraits and the like, you will not see rugs on the floor. You will see a silk velvet or some sort of a silk floor covering. The Chinese tended to think of wool as the product of barbarians, and they were a silk culture. So you'll see that reflected in their paintings. Okay, and I think that's what I was going to say about the development of the furnishing carpets. And of course, we've come into our own time with modern versions of all these being produced in all sorts of countries.
Thank you, Michael. You already have one person who wants to buy a rug. Sue says, can you recommend a good dealer? How you store your collection? That's two questions, actually.
Yeah, okay. So when people ask me for advice on carpets, I always ask them, do you know your taste? If they haven't lived with rugs, if they're not familiar with them, this is something that's a question sometimes takes them by surprise. Do you know what you like? Often they don't. So a good place to start is by not running out to a store and buying something, but by going and looking online. There's enormous numbers of opportunities to see various types of patterns and so forth. And then getting an idea, well, I like block geometric motifs. I prefer the floral patterning. I like these kinds of colorations and so forth. My own tastes have changed considerably over the time I've been collecting. So I'm familiar with this transition from liking something on the first day and then still liking it, but being more intrigued by something else as you go along. So that's a good place to start. When it comes to, and then of course you come into a variety of other questions. Do you want a brand new rug? So brand new rugs are easy to come by because they're being made brand new. Do you want an older rug? Do you like the look of the older rug? They're out there, of course, and some of them are definitely worthy, and some of them are perhaps not so much. But that will also apply to a brand new rug. So here again, a little thought and perhaps a little self-educating would be helpful. It's useful to go, if you don't have much experience with it, to visit a house of somebody who does, or to visit a particularly tolerant dealer who's willing to go through a stack and another stack and another stack and have you look at it and say, well, I don't really, I'll think about it. So that's a good place to start. And then in terms of the local trade, I know the dealers in Washington and also in one in particular in Northern Virginia. So if anybody actually wanted to pursue that further, you can get in touch with me through Kartika and I'll give you some more direct advice on that.
And recently I had Nazmial I introduced Nazmial to some of my
Mhm.
students at Montgomery College.
Sure.
I should have asked you what you thought about them before I did it, but they
No.
have an excellent website. So
Yeah, they have an excellent website and they explain things.
yes.
So their approach is obviously going to be different than mine. Most people who go into looking to buy a rug are looking to furnish a room or whatever. They're looking for it to be complementary or compatible with whatever else is in the room in terms of coloration and so forth. Color being really one of the most prominent features of that decision. And so when you go into a dealer store, they'll often ask you, well, are you trying to match a color in your sofa or your drapes or something like that? So that can be a prominent consideration. I have to tell you, I never go into a store and ask them for something that's going to match my drapes or my sofa. That's not the basis of my interest. So, but for most people that is. So that's really the consideration. So if that's what you're looking for, then you need to have a sense of what it is you're trying to work with, whether or not this is going to go with that or not. And the other is, of course, as Kartika and I have discussed on a number of occasions, are you comfortable with color?
Now they are.
Now they are. Okay. So,
they should be.
yeah.
That's actually unfair. Perhaps they were already when they started. Perhaps they were already comfortable.
Yeah. But many people aren't.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, one more question. I would like to give the space to the students, so I'll
Okay.
reserve my comments. Meredith, why did sumac never become as popular as other techniques? Mm-hmm.
Well, any flat woven structure is going to be, in terms of a wearable, it's something that wears well. I don't mean something you're going to put on, but something that serves as an effective floor covering. Any flat weave will be degraded much more quickly than a pile carpet. There's simply more wool in a pile carpet. And so sumac also was very popular in traditional use for making vessels, devices for carrying bags and so forth. There's an enormous production of sumac saddlebags. In terms of floor furnishing, then you contend with the problem of, will it survive? Will it last? So in an Eastern household, it would be common to take off your shoes, your outdoor shoes, as you come in. In a Western household, it's much less common. So when you come in from the street, you are carrying the grit, the dirt, the sand, etc., on your shoes. Even if you try to knock it off, it's still going to be there. And those are very powerful abrasives, and they just shear the fibers over time. Or you have a piece of furniture which is moving back and forth. If you've ever seen a rug that used to be in a dining room, what you'll see is that the region of the rug that was under the table is intact. And the region that is the places where the chairs were being moved back and forth is a wreck. Just couldn't take it. So that will be true for any flat weave, including sumac.
And kilims, right? Kilims.
Same for kilims. My kilims are on the wall. They're not on the floor.
That's true. I have to go back. I'm sorry, I just kind of went down. I'm not going to ignore your questions. Sue had asked, how do you store your collection?
Yeah. So the first thing, if you're buying an old piece, you have to expect that it hasn't been washed sometime since the day it was made. So it's very important to get it washed, because it's carrying in it a lot of dirt, an enormous amount of dirt that you may not be aware of. And it may often carry in with it insect eggs, like moth eggs and things like that. And so you've got to get rid of that. So whenever I get a new piece in, I wash it. If you don't trust me, I wash it.
Professional.
Well, I do it myself, or In some cases, I'll have somebody else do it. But if if the dyes are fast, then you can well, you can think about washing it. If they're not fast, you don't want to wash it. And newer carpets, let's say anything in the 20th century, you have to be a little thoughtful about. So that's where a professional cleaning facility is useful. If you're buying a brand new rug, it was washed before it came to you, so that's not really an issue. As far as storing pieces, the smaller pieces, I typically store them in trunks or sometimes rolled up, but I make sure they're clean. And then I store them with camphor. Now, some people store them with mothballs, but mothballs are extremely irritating. I find them very upsetting. I can't stand to be around them. So I tend to prefer camphor. You can get camphor at pharmacies and drugstores and so forth. And that's a very powerful deterrent, and it works well. So my trunks smell like Vicks, you know, the kind of stuff, same thing that's in a vapor rub type. And you get little blocks of it from stores. And I'll toss a block in periodically into a trunk. And so the pieces come out smelling of camphor, which is not an unpleasant smell. It clears your nasal passages as long as it's there, and then you get a double benefit. Yes, mothballs are neurotoxins. I do not like them.
Yeah, they've been banned in Europe.
I hope so. They're
Yeah.
terrible.
Yes. Okay. Now from Allison, can you discuss carpet restoration? This is an interesting topic. We were talking about all that. How are colors and kinds of materials reproduced?
Okay, so this is a good question. First of all, I should say there are two ways to deal with a rug that needs attention. One is called conservation. Now, this is what they would do at a museum. They simply stitch it down. They stabilize the ends or the sides or any holes, but they don't try to reweave it. They'll just hold it as it is. But they don't. They will treat it in such a way that if they were going to display it, let's say on a wall, it won't further fall apart. Maybe it's stitched down onto a linen backing. So the 2 key limb fragments I showed you are stitched down onto linen. So if they're corroded, and I can see as I look at it that the black is corroded because the dye was corrosive, they're stitched down. I don't have to worry about it falling apart. That's conservation. If you want to have breaks on the borders or the edges or the ends or a hole in the middle because the moths got into the piece and so on, then you might consider having it repiled or rewoven. That's another consideration, and there are people who can do that. So in order to do that, there have been 3 strategies that have been employed over time. If we were having this conversation in the 19th and early 20th century, we would get a patch. We'd find another rug that had something similar. We'd cut out a patch from that rug and we would sew it in to the rug that needed attention. Let's say it had a moth hole. But they don't do that very much anymore. Nowadays, well, then we would go into a period of time where they would reweave. But unfortunately, they would reweave or they would introduce wool that was with recently spun wool and recently dyed wool. And even if it was dyed with a vegetable dye, what you find is that the texture of the rewoven area looks different. It feels different because the wool is springier. It hasn't, this is particularly for an old rug, the wool hasn't had a chance to relax over 100 to 200 years. So right away, your eye goes right to that place. And then over time, let's say 20 years, you know exactly where that rug was rewoven because the color isn't the same. It might have been the same match on the day it was put in, but it's not the same match now because in particular with a vegetable dye, it's going to fade out. It'll mellow out. So a rug that's woven with freshly dyed wool in 1800, that rug does not look the same in 1900. And the weaver who wove it in 1800 wouldn't recognize it in 1900 because the colors have sort of modified. In fact, the bright new brash rug that you saw in 1800 is probably less pleasing than the one you see in 1900 if the colors are good. Because they just much like a piece of furniture, antique furniture develops a patina, the same thing is happening with those colors. So nowadays, the best restorers who are reweaving holes in rugs will take an old kilim 100-year-old kilim that's a wreck. And they'll pull out the wool, which is now relaxed and has a color which is stable because it's been sitting there for 100 years. And they'll use that to repile the regions of interest. And if you go into one of these shops, I've done that, you'll see stacks and stacks of old wrecked kilims, which are going to be used for restoration purposes.
Yeah. Just the only, I mean, the Ardabil, I don't know how they, I'm still intrigued by that story, you know.
Yeah.
Was the other one a bit of a wreck? Like,
yeah, so it was more of a wreck, and the borders, for example, and the other one aren't there anymore because they were used to patch up the big one in the V&A. But there are pieces of the border, for example, that are still out in the collector world. I have a friend who owns one of those little fragments.
Of the Ardabil?
Of the art bill, it probably costs about $30,000 for a little piece. It's about a foot square.
Okay, if you see another piece floating around, just let Sue know.
I'll let you know.
I'll tell Sue. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Regina says, and I think she's echoing all our thoughts. Thank you very much for such an informative talk. What made you interested in collecting? If you are to pick, so she has several questions. Let's start with this. What made you interested in collecting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I got exposed to this material many, many, many years ago. I was living in California at the time, and I happened to meet people who were actually at that time coming back from Iran. This is after Peace Corps volunteers would be in Iran or Turkey, for example, and they would come back. I was in Berkeley. I was a graduate student in Berkeley. And you would meet them, and of course they were very exotic and had these romantic tales, but they also had these carpets that they were bringing back. And so that looked pretty interesting to me. I just had an interest in it for reasons that are a little hard to explain. Why do you like this and not like that? I have developed other interests, of course, at that time, but that was one of them. And when I came to Washington, a few years later, I happened to go to the Textile Museum, which is still an institution here in Washington. And the Textile Museum still has programs on Saturday mornings where anybody in the public can come in and somebody will give a talk on one or another aspect of carpets or textiles. Kartik has done this, I've done this. So there you had an opportunity not only to see material, sometimes in the early days from the museum collection, but always from the person who was speaking from their collections. But you also got to meet all these interesting people who had been coming in from all over the world, and they had all these stories. It was really quite intriguing. Somebody would hold up something and say, well, you notice this particular motif, and somebody in the back of the room would say, well, when I was in Tashkent last weekend, and this is what I saw, and here's an example of what I brought back. It's really quite magical. So one thing led to another. But in the end, like it is, as is the case with all other arts and crafts, the work of the hand, you're dealing with compositions of material, of design and drawing, and coloration. Those are the fundamentals for whatever the medium is, ceramic or wood or what have you. And so I've come to understand and regard these as these are compositions in much the same way. And so that's the way I tend to look at them.
And thank you. To continue with what Regina is asking, if you are to pick one textile collection in the US for its quality, which one would you recommend to visit?
Are we talking about a museum or an individual?
Museum.
Museum.
Put your, go ahead.
So the Metropolitan Museum in New York City has an Islamic wing. And in the Islamic wing, there are rooms devoted to particular Islamic areas, sort of the art of the Islamic empires, if you will. So there's a room that is Persian with enormously incredible, fabulous material. There's a room that's devoted to India and the Mughal arts, including carpets and textiles, equally incredible and fabulous. And there's one that's devoted to the Ottoman material. So if I had to go to one place, that's where I'd go. It's really amazing. And the exhibitions change they rotate the rugs. So if you come back 6 months to a year later, you're going to see another group.
Mm. Yeah. I think that was it. I don't see any other questions, but please feel free to put on your mics and ask Michael any other questions. I had put down a few questions myself, but we should continue our conversations. I want to know more about the Giri tiles. Why are they called Giri? Because
Yeah.
of the place where they're from?
Yeah, that may be. I'm not exactly sure where the name comes from,
Yeah.
but they are a very prominent feature of Islamic and pre-Islamic design, and so of course they percolate into all the other art forms.
Yeah. And then where is the Ottoman rug with the arches? Where is that? Where can we see that?
I think that's in New York.
It's at the Met?
Yeah, I think that's from the Ballard collection.
Okay.
So one of the strengths of the Met, and the reason it's so strong, is that the robber barons of the first part of the late 19th, early 20th century, many of them gave important pieces to the Met. And then the major collectors, particularly out of New York City, Joseph McMullen being the most famous, who were very active in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth, buying amazing things that you can no longer find on the market. They also donated many of those pieces to the Met. Mm-hmm. So this is as Walter Denny likes to say, this is a path to immortality. You donate a piece to a museum, your name is on that piece now forever and ever. The piece gets exhibited every once 5 or 10 years. Your name's on that label. You're long gone, but your name is there.
Yeah, just for my students, Walter Denny is a very well-known researcher, and he's reputed in this world of carpets. Once in a while, he comes and speaks in DC, and he's the one who said that, we all like to say, oh, this is a butterfly motif. And I was very disappointed when he said that, because I really thought, okay, these kilims, they have this kind of a motif, and this is what it means, and probably this is what it is. And then he smashed it all down and he said, this is our interpretation, it's our perception, and we see maybe a woman wearing a skirt, but very probably the villager who wove a certain shape may have woven it because it's something that she has woven over the years. She may be copying something, like Michael was saying, or it may be also the knots that she uses that, ask for simplifying shape. Michael, you can carry on if you like.
Yeah, no, all those things are true, precisely.
Yeah. Anyway. So, any other questions?
I do have a question. The books you recommended, do they cover technique in detail?
The Island book will cover that in some detail. You can get obviously much more detailed, but typically they'll discuss that.
I'm working on a project with a guy from Iran, and we're both doing sumac, and we're not able to find very much information at all about sumac techniques.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll send you some information through Kartika. John Wertheim, let me give you another name, John Wertheim, Wertime,
Okay.
has books on precisely sumac material.
Okay.
Typically bags and covers and so forth. I'll have to check and see if he covers the weaving technique, but that, and Marla Mallet, do you know that name?
No.
Marla Mallet's got a great website.
Yes, she's very good. She's a weaver and she's also a dealer, and she's very, very good on technique.
And
so
how do you spell her name?
It's Mallett, I think. Marla.
Okay.
First name Marl.
Sorry.
Yeah. I definitely would check with her as well because
Okay.
she has a strong focus on that.
Yeah, we're sort of reinventing or trying to figure things out, and he's actually from Kashan,
Hmm.
but we just don't have a whole lot of information on some
Yeah.
of the basic technique
Over
is
over two, back
straightforward.
one. Over
Huh?
over two, back one.
Well, the basic technique is easy, but then, you know, when you're like where you're talking about curvilinear designs, and it becomes a problem with sumac if you're going to try to
Yeah.
stabilize it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why you don't do curvilinear designs.
But I've seen them. I mean, we've seen
Yeah.
them
You have
in
to work at
some,
it. Yeah.
right,
And
exactly.
also, it somewhat depends. So, sumac is there are two forms of it. Uh, many sumacs will have a ground weft that you don't even know about. You don't see because it's not the patterning.
Right.
So you have a structure to work with. If you pulled out all of the sumac patterning, you would still have a textile. There would still be a woven structure. But there's also a product in Eastern Turkey that we call weftless sumac. And there the sumac is the structure. And of course, they're very fragile. They fall apart.
Right, right.
So a wefted sumac will give you some superstructure to work with.
Well, that's interesting. I should send you pictures of what my friend is doing because he's actually doing some fairly complex sumac and really beautiful with, you know, sort of contemporary Iranian feel to it.
Sure.
It's very beautiful.
Yeah. Well, he must know he must know John Wertheim's work on that subject.
I wonder because we've discussed these things and you know we've ordered books and we just haven't found a whole lot. But yeah, we obviously have failed in that area.
Yeah, well, Murray Island won't cover very much of that. He's mostly that's the discussion of pile carpets, and he won't do very much with kilims and flatweeds. It's typically pile carpets.
Okay.
There are other excellent books for kilims, certainly plenty of those.
Yeah.
Anyway, John Wertheim, look him up. He'll have a presence online, and he has published a number of books and some very beautiful material in there.
Okay, great. Thank you a lot.
Marla Mallet too, right?
Yeah, Marla Mallet.
On her website, she has lots of technique.
Yeah, excellent for structure.
Yeah, it's not evident. You have to kind of dig around. So be persistent and kind of, you know, click on a whole lot of things and you'll eventually end up finding lots of technical information.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Just wanted to say thank you. It was very interesting. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kartika, for organizing. Michael, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's really very interesting.
It was really thorough.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think Catherine, my friend, also wanted to say thank you. And then not my friend, my student, I'm sorry. And then there's this other student also who said that she was, you know, very interested and she enjoyed it. Oh, Maureen is saying, I'm looking for the Zoom meetings for the Saturday monthly rug appreciation talks, but can't find them. But they are recorded and I have the last few months if anybody wants links. Yes.
If you participate, they send you the link later on. I can't see anywhere on the website that has them all nice.
Yeah, there's one coming up on the 5th of December, which would be very interesting because it's this is the Textile Museum rug morning you're talking about. Yeah, so they're featuring Bill Ruprecht, who originally was head of the carpet department at Sotheby's and then became CEO of Sotheby's, and Mary Jo Otzi, who was the head of the carpet department, and she was the auctioneer who sold the Corcoran rug for $34 million. So she'll be probably talking about that.
Yeah. Sue says, thank you for your talk. I'm now going to run downstairs and take a closer look at the rug I bought on a whim recently from a dealer who came to town.
Yes. Okay. So dealers who come to town, let me just mention. So let me just make a point of that. So if you've ever gone to Istanbul, I don't know if some of you may or may not have, you've made the round of the shops and so forth. 6 months to a year later, you're going to get a call. You will often get a call from somebody who says, you visited my shop, how's the rug doing? Or I'm in town, I have some rugs, maybe you'd like to see them. Yeah, Okay. So what that fellow has done, and there's nothing wrong with this. They're not being dishonest in any way. He's gone to a local supplier of rugs. He's filled up a van and he's driving around seeing people that had been in Istanbul. Now, you may not have ever been in his shop. He probably doesn't actually have a shop. But what he has is a list of people who have been in Istanbul. And he has a way to get in touch with them.
Yes.
So there's nothing wrong with that. The rugs are okay. There's no problem with them. They're not being dishonest. They're just trying to make their way in the world. And this is one of the ways they do it. I get a call like this every 6 months.
This was connected with a local fair trade shop.
Yeah.
The dealer came to town. And yeah, you're right. They have contacted me several times since I bought that rug.
Right. Yeah.
But I love that rug. And
That's
and I
great.
love going into to where they had set up like in a warehouse and they just had piles and piles of rugs.
Right. Yeah. Well, those did not come with them from Turkey. They came from a local.
Yeah.
Shipping would be too much. But anyway, that's fine. That's a nice way to do it.
And as long as you love the rug, right?
Yeah.
Right.
The next one will be from a reputable dealer. Thank you so much.
All right. Very good.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Okay, so Michael, thanks a lot.
Mhm.
It was very comprehensive. I think they learned a lot. And I'll give you feedback. I'll give
Okay.
you more feedback when they get back to me, but I think they really enjoyed it.
Good.
The students enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Great.
Okay. Terrific. All right. Well, that was fun.
Okay.
See you soon, I hope.
Yeah, I'm going to drop by tomorrow. I have to remember. I'm teaching a class in the afternoon, but after that I'll walk across.
Okay. Very good.
Is
Take
that
care.
good? Are you around? Will you be there tomorrow?
At my house tomorrow? Yeah, just let us know about when. We may or may not be going over to our daughter's sometime in the day, but we don't know exactly when.
Okay.
So just get in touch. We'll work it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Michael. Thanks again.
Sure. That was
Good
fun.
evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.